Fisheries. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and restoring wild salmonid populations and their habitats through restoration, protection, education, and community involvement throughout our region of the central and south central Washington. We have some members of our board, and I think we have members of our board, yeah, and some of our staff here. So if you can show us your faces and give everybody a smile and a wave, please, if you can. Thank you. So this evening's talk is making sense of the numbers, fish population trends in the mid-Columbia and beyond. I've always enjoyed listening to tonight's speaker share his knowledge of all things fish in and around the Yakima Basin. And so it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Alex Conley. Alex has been the executive director of the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board since 2006. He grew up poking around the woods and coast of New England and has received an undergraduate degree in biology from Williams College in Massachusetts before moving west. Alex enjoys learning about the complex landscapes and the human livelihoods they support. And he strives to bring together technical experts, stakeholders, and policymakers to forge sound approaches to managing and restoring river systems in the Yakima Basin. So before we get started, I'm going to do some housekeeping. We're going to have time for questions and answers after the presentation. You can type your questions in the chat box or ask it at the end. Alex did throw on there that he said call him on anything if you would like in the middle, but we'll try to respect his time. We're going to keep folks muted during the presentation as best as we can. And we can unmute you, but you're going to have to unmute yourself. Hopefully mine's working. I'm saying I'm getting network issues today or now. If you called in on the phone, please mute yourself on your own phone. Our platform doesn't support us muting you from here. Just like Zoom, you can change the view from everyone to just who's talking, which makes it a little bit better for a presentation for you. And you'll find that on your screen at the top center. You'll see view everyone. You can click that and change that to just who's talking, so you can see just that person. And then after, okay, if the slides look small on your screen, you can also enlarge them by wiggling your mouse on there, and you'll see plus and minus buttons on the right side. Click the plus and that'll enlarge the screen for you. Okay, so after tonight, we have one more talk of our Winter Speakers series. It's presented by our very own Kat Strothman, our plant ecologist at Mid-Columbia Fisheries. And that's going to be on March 8th, 2022 at 7 p.m. And she's going to be speaking on cottonwood establishment in the Yakima Basin, what we are learning for fish. So we hope you'll join us on that next talk. And we're glad you're here tonight. And with that, I'm going to pass the floor over to Alex to give his presentation. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mike. And it's great to see a mix of names I know well and folks I don't know on the call, and a ton of knowledge on this call. So I will throw some ideas out there, but I'm really actually excited to open up some discussion after. I just got distracted by Eastie commenting on my fuzziness, and actually it's my wife that won't let me cut it, Eastie. I think she really likes the fantasy of dating a new guy after 24 years. But all right, I'm going to jump into this presentation. So I am sharing a screen with you. Is that showing up? And let me get rid of this. Oh, there. All right, can you see a title screen here?
Yep, looks great.
All right. And I know in some of the advertisements about this, the title was shortened to Fish Population Trends in the Mid-Columbia, but a lot of what I've got here is trying to put it in a broader context of what's going on in the Columbia Basin and the Pacific, and how that helps us think about where we're at in the Yakima right now. I'm going to start, oh, sorry. All right, I'm going to start just with the really big picture, the global view. And of course, we're going to be mainly talking about the Eastern Pacific. And there's some things that even though you know perfectly well, never seem intuitive, like that the Pacific Northwest is in the Eastern Pacific. We'll also talk a little bit about the Western Pacific, which really connects to the Eastern Pacific. The other big place where we've had salmon traditionally is the North Atlantic, Atlantic salmon. And we often hear in our world some talk about the challenges of Atlantic salmon management over the year. And I want to touch on that in one sec. I couldn't help myself, but also say, you know, we often forget there's something a heck of a lot like a steelhead in a lot of Europe. That's the sea trout. It's an ocean-going brown trout, an anadromous lifestyle. We don't often think of something like a steelhead living in Iran, in the rivers of highland Iran, migrating to the Caspian Sea or in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, but they're there. So yeah, lots of interesting parallels. I threw on a few other interesting salmonids. You know, Timon, many of you on this call no doubt know him as a meter-long, sometimes 100-pound migratory salmonid. Who knows what this little circle I threw over New England is? My home country. Eastie probably knows what a salter is. Salter's an anadromous brook trout. Not something we think out here where brook trout are a pesky invasive, but a real focus of some conservation efforts. And yeah, there are anadromous brook trout. Not huge, but certainly bigger than they otherwise would be. Anyone heard of a hoochin? Again, a lot like the Timon. This is a big migratory trout of the Danube and the Black Sea. So lots of different salmon-like species around the world. But I'm right now really just going to talk for 1 second about Atlantic salmon. We often hear it the cautionary tale. We wipe them out in the Atlantic, and that's what we're trying not to do in the Pacific. There's certainly truth to that. You get down to the Connecticut River. Are folks seeing my mouse when I move it around? Oh, okay,
Yes,
good. People are.
we can see it.
Good. So you get to the Connecticut River, and yeah, between dam building associated with mills and other changes, Atlantic salmon were basically gone, 200 years ago now. And we had a massive investment from the 1960s through the mid-2000s to try and bring them back. Never got a run above 200 fish, and about 5 years ago decided to call it quits. There's still a lot of anadromous fish recovery work going on in New England, but it's really focused on herring, alewife, and above all shad. We've got the Gulf of Maine, where it's a listed species and not doing so well. Parts of Canada, where it's traditionally held on a lot better, still is certainly doing better, but struggling. But there are also success stories. If you look from the Kola Peninsula in Russia to Norway, to Scotland, to Iceland, to Ireland, there are a lot of wild Atlantic salmon rivers. They've seen some ups and downs in marine productivity and some recent declines that are certainly unnerving, but there are wild intact Atlantic salmon systems. There are also big efforts to try and bring them back. So we've got a real mix of population trends. The Rhine is a place more developed than the Columbia, where we're seeing similar $100 million investments in infrastructure to try and get salmon back up the Rhine to Germany and Switzerland. We've seen natural recolonization as industrial pollution's been cleaned up of a lot of southern England's rivers, of the Seine. We've seen the reintroduction of salmon into the Thames River. So a total mix of stories showing that where we have intact habitats, we are in fact still seeing Atlantic salmon production, even as we see big changes in ocean productivity. Compared to this side of the mountains, maybe a different focus on limiting factors. The biggest push in the North Atlantic has been limiting fisheries, whether that's all the small commercial net fisheries in a lot of Europe, the Greenland ocean fishery, the huge effort to basically eliminate commercial net fisheries for Atlantic salmon, and seen a big response in response to that. You also see a level of interaction with aquaculture from the coast of Norway to Scotland to Ireland that's almost hard to fathom for us, just the intensive interaction of Atlantic salmon farms right in the middle of estuaries that have native Atlantic salmon runs, and all the interactions, both ecologically and food web and disease-wise, that creates. So different story in the Atlantic, probably just as complex as ours, a mix of some great success stories, growing populations in northern Sweden and the Baltic, and fish showing up places they haven't been for 200 years, and other places, sadly, many of them on our coast, where the trends are pretty dire. But we're not going to spend this talk in the Atlantic. I just wanted to sort of give an overall sense that we're not alone in the complexity of our issues. And there you can, it's interesting, often in the Atlantic, habitat doesn't have the same kind of focus on natural habitat. You've got a place that's been heavily managed for thousands of years, and luckily in a lot of cold, wet places like this Trophy River in Scotland, surprisingly productive even in what we would look at as a fairly heavily managed state. And just to point out infrastructure, this is down near where my mother's family's from in southern Holland. This is the massive dike that they are having to open up the gates of to allow salmon through, and probably the biggest bottleneck in the efforts to restore salmon in the Rhine. So huge infrastructure in some places and surprisingly intact little steep rivers in others. Now salmon also, we've seen a lot of range expansions, something that's a little odd when we're so used to thinking about where they're declining. So where have we seen them? Well, the Great Lakes. If you go to Chicago, you can hop on a charter boat to go chase Chinook and coho. And I've only included places here where there's a significant and long-standing multiple generation component of natural production. So yeah, the Great Lakes didn't used to be salmon producing, but pretty productive for coho and Chinook. Though Superior is so dang cold, their Chinook run like 4 pounds. Chile, if you want to go to a high-end fishing resort in Chile to catch Chinook and coho, there are quite a few that will vie for your dollars. Most popular fishery on the North Island in New Zealand, again, Chinook. So, and these are all populations that are self-sustaining, obviously originally introduced. We've also got places where salmon are spreading of their own in the Western Arctic, up through the Bering Sea, and then east and west in Russia and in the US and Canadian Arctic. We're seeing an expansion of especially pink and chum into areas that had some salmon, but really marginal, and new areas that never had any, pretty clearly related to climate change. In Europe, we've seen pink salmon, presumably from introductions that were done back in the 60s in Russia, and also maybe now across the top of the Arctic there. Pink salmon are showing up in rivers in Britain and expanding on their own from those original plants. So salmon expanding in new places. Interesting paper recently looked at the glacial retreat in Alaska and BC and calculated that as the glaciers retreated, there would be about 2,000 kilometers of new salmon rivers appearing, even as we're losing other salmon rivers. So salmon are dynamic. Even as we're dealing with contractions and crashing species, we've got other success stories. We have these sort of oddball areas where you don't think of salmon, where there increasingly are. Rest of this talk going to focus on the Pacific and bring that back to our home country. But when we're talking about the Pacific, there are a few different stories. If you start with Japan, Korea, China, and Southeast Russia, all salmon nations, but really limited to chum salmon and to masu salmon, cherry salmon, in the southern part of this range. And if you look, for instance, at Japan, large commercial fisheries almost exclusively supported by hatchery releases, very little natural production in southern Russia or Japan or Korea or the parts of China here that have rivers that come down through Korea and Russia. So very highly managed fisheries there. We'll talk about those in a minute. The Amar River, the biggest river in the Asian side of the Pacific with salmon, lots of pinks, lots of chum, some coho, no Chinook, no steelhead, big river, lots of fish, and sort of where the Columbia was in 1880 or 1900. Huge fishery impacts, poorly regulated, and people trying to get their handle around just basic fisheries management. How do we allow enough escapement to make for a sustainable fishery? And then we can come up to, Kamchatka and surrounding areas. This is the salmon biologist, Shangri-La. This is the place with the most species it has of all. It has a cherry salmon plus our 5 species, and people love to throw Taiman in there too. But a lot of really diverse life histories, intact ecosystems, and also a lot of call it Wild East development. This is an area that is in the throes of resource development, only moderately regulated. So some of the most intact salmon habitat, but also real fisheries and habitat issues, incredible diversity. Then our part of the world, where I'll spend the rest of this talk, though it'll come back a little bit to the Asian Pacific. The Pacific Northwest in the US, BC, Alaska. So when you start to look at salmon runs here, you can say, hey, this was an absolute record year for Bristol Bay sockeye. So good thing we're not building those copper mines in the new administration, because man, this place pumps out fish and it's been doing great. And say, oh, it's also record year for Prince William Sound pink salmon. We had some volatile Fraser River sockeye runs, really poor runs 2 years ago, a little bit better right now, but not so great. Our steelhead run's been in the tank down here. Tough year in California, especially. Actually, some good runs and a lot of pre-spawn mortality due to the heat and drought. So you can start to say, it's a north-south pattern. Seems simple. Nothing simple with salmon. So you throw in a strong northwestern coho run. You throw in essentially a run collapse in the Yukon of it for both Chinook and chum. So it's a crappy year to be a moose in the Yukon, because when people can't get fish, the next best thing to feed your family are moose. So yeah, you start I could keep throwing dots in here in all kinds of colors, and the scatter of the colors is enough to say more is going on here than just some simple north-south gradient or climate change gradient. There are different drivers hitting different runs in different places. We've seen a real drop in spring Chinook from south, really their whole range, but especially Southeast Alaska right down to us. So what's up in the Pacific? Why all this volatility? This graph, and I apologize it's small, but many of you have seen graphs like this before, looking at variable conditions due to the Pacific decadal oscillation, natural variability in the ocean, looking at warming trends, looking at copepod biomass. And the short answer, without reading all the legend, is that the more red you see, the worse the ocean conditions are for salmon. The more green, the better. And you can see periods with series of good years and bad years. We all know this. You can see a lot of concern about the clump of bad years lately. And you'll note 2021, at least based on this set of NOAA indicators, was actually the second best ocean year since this chart began in '98. So lots of variability in the ocean, not in a single direction. Long-term cycles that have always happened, definitely warming trends, but not consistent. And you also have to remember that salmon really below Vancouver Island are a function of cold water upwelling. You know, you go out past the cold water to get to the tuna water. Well, it's that upwelling that's made the West Coast originally a salmon coast all the way down to northern Baja. So also seeing lots of food web changes in the ocean. We know this, we talk about it a lot. We tend to have a sense when the salmon are bad in our area, it's the ocean, there's nothing we can do about it. I wanted to talk about some other things going on in the ocean that maybe are a little more surprising than this graph. And the first is, and this is out of a great paper by Rougaron and Irving from 2018, there are, and I think this has stood up pretty well, more salmon than ever in the Pacific Ocean. So if you look at overall abundance, the last big peak, we have records, the records can start to get somewhat reliable of catches and other things you can extrapolate abundance from in the 20s. Last big peak was in the 30s. 2015 was 36% higher than that peak. When you look at it, it's dominated in numbers by pinks, chum next, sockeye, and this blue, that's coho, Chinook, and steelhead. Everything else, all the stuff that we tend to focus on, that's less than 7% of the Pacific Ocean abundance. And when you break down the pinks are the most by number, they're about half by biomass. Chum are bigger, so they're less by number, they'll come up. But that's less than 7% for Chinook, coho, and steelhead. Yeah, the ocean is dominated by actually growing stocks of chum, pink, and sockeye. If you look at, and this is again from that same Rougaron paper, different areas, the blue is natural production, the yellow is hatchery. So for sockeye, we can see, yeah, not much coming out of Asia. It's really coming out of North America, most all of that from Alaska, but at times good contribution from BC, a growing contribution from the Columbia, very little hatchery component. Chum salmon, remember I said those Japanese and Russian fisheries? Yeah, massive chum hatchery releases in the last 30 years, growing, supporting big fisheries. And on the US side too, yeah, 30% of the chum in the ocean coming out of hatcheries. You can see the composite of both sides, and they really do, depending on the species and mix in the mid-Pacific. Whoops, let's go back. Pink salmon, big pink releases in Alaska, big growth of pinks all the way down the coast. Actually, the big growth in salmon in the state of Washington is in the pinks. Again, these are the fish we tend not to focus on, but really make up the mass of salmon biomass in the ocean. 40% of it hatchery. Well, are we seeing density dependence in the ocean? I think we've gotten enough studies now showing a strong correlation, a negative correlation between pink abundance and Chinook numbers and size. Now I say correlation, not causation. This is still emerging in the literature, but we have a strong overlap between Chinook and pink in the ocean waters in the Gulf of Alaska. There's indications from studies from Alaska to Puget Sound showing the correlation. Puget Sound, well, with the dramatic 2-year cycle of pinks, they can look and see the different density dependence levels for Chinook growth, juvenile Chinook growth, based on whether or not it is a pink year. So that's probably the place we're getting nearest to a causal link. Also, some indications that the pink growth is also negatively impacting Alaska sockeye. So what we're seeing here is we've got more fish in the ocean. We've got strong components, for instance, the Central Alaskan pink hatchery releases for a high volume, low value fishery that's probably negatively impacting the higher value but lower volume Chinook fisheries from Alaska down to here. These are issues we haven't really had to wrangle with. We've got a Pacific Salmon Treaty to allocate adult harvest. How the heck do you think about allocating juvenile rearing capacity in the ocean between runs? And for steelhead, whoops, sorry. You steelhead tend to head more directly out to the ocean. And there's some indications actually that they may be affected by pink abundances coming out of Asia. But I'd say this is a much less developed story than it seems to be for Chinook. But definitely that question. We used to think of the ocean as an unlimited pasture. We know it's facing challenges with climate change, and yet it's got more salmon, some of that in our control, than ever before. Also had a massive reduction in ocean fisheries. And I'm always amazed when you talk to people who about what we do in the salmon world, how many of them say, yeah, but they're just all getting sucked up by foreigners in the ocean. Well, that was true in the 70s before we expanded the 200-mile exclusive zone. That was maybe more true before the US-Canada Salmon Treaty, which limited Canadian, Alaskan, and Northwestern harvests and set up systems for us to I was going to say reimburse folks for lost opportunity, but it's essentially created a regulated regime to protect US salmon and coming all the way down from Alaska to the Columbia. We had a pretty effective ban of the high sea gill nets back in '92. So overall numbers show saltwater Chinook harvest is about halved. The Columbia is one of the mainstays of remaining harvest, supporting fisheries up through Alaska. And we see really for steelhead limited saltwater harvest. So ocean fisheries, definitely a big component of what went on in the past, but something that's dropped a lot. So we've got more salmon in the ocean, potential issues with density dependence, reduced fisheries, removing them from the ocean, but we have another thing going on too. We've got a dramatic increase in marine mammals. So we know that we have a decline in the small population of southern resident orcas. We've had a doubling, more than a doubling of the Canadian and Alaska resident orcas, who are also Chinook specialists in the coastal waters. An increase in transient and open ocean orca populations. Nearly a doubling of coastwide harbor seal numbers. a 5 to 10-fold increase in California sea lions since the Marine Mammal Act made it illegal to hunt them, both in big commercial hunts and also in, back when every fishing trawler had a rifle handy to plink away at any marine mammal scene. We've seen a moderate increase in the Steller sea lions, so parts of the range were still marginal enough to have them listed. But overall, pretty good estimates that from 75 to 2015, that we saw an increase, and this is in number of adult Chinook salmon, from 5 to 31 million. So about halving of the human take, even as we saw a 6-fold increase in the marine mammal take. And this is from a paper by Casseron et al. That was quantifying this and shows the black line is harvest levels, aggregate. And I just pulled out the Columbia River and Puget Sound, but this includes the entire Pacific Northwest up through Alaska. Real decline in that human harvest numbers with some up and down. The shaded lines are the wild and hatchery consumption by marine mammals. So you can see overall the 3-fold increase in marine mammal consumption decline. Columbia, it's interesting, we have been a mainstay of sustaining harvest. So while if you back this graph up, you'd see a bigger drop from the 40s through the 80s. From the 80s on, we've seen Columbia River harvests up and down. Remember, this is including the coastal Alaska fleet that fishes on Columbia River fish, BC harvest. Whoops, sorry. I'm running on a single monitor and it means that I'm bumping the wrong thing. But also this massive increase in overall marine mammal consumption. Note, this doesn't just mean sea lions at Bonneville. In fact, the two biggest drivers of this are orca consumption on adult fish as they come down the coast on their way back from the ocean past Alaska, BC, and into the Columbia. And the sea lions fit in, of course, but also seal predation on juveniles. And if you look at the Salish Sea, you can see an even more dramatic picture of massive, in this case, almost 6-fold reduction in fisheries, and at the same time, a really more than doubling in the take. So when you look, we've reduced fisheries, but the overall consumption of salmon in the ocean across all species of harvesters is actually significantly up. And when you look at the range maps for ocean movements, you can see a lot of our Columbia stocks are actually out in the open Pacific and coming back with some of the longest exposures to transient orcas, and also as juveniles, probably the seal predation's the highest in the inland seas of the Salish Sea, but not insignificant here. And in the Columbia, we all know the sea lion story of recent years. So it's much more than just sea lions. It's actually an amazing success story, bringing back that many different species of marine mammals from really dire straits into just 30 to 40 years to, for many of them, approaching their historic levels. But it means real trade-offs. We are successfully recovering salmon that are feeding other species we value. We have reduced our harvest, and we're going to continue to have to balance that trade-off going forward. So summary, what's up in the Pacific? Real variable ocean conditions with increasing warming, increasing overall salmon abundance when you look, but dominated by pinks, chums, and sockeye, just that 7% in the species we tend to focus on. Possible density dependence impacting Chinook and Steelhead. I think for Chinook, we're beyond just possible and to clear, though the impacts and details still to be worked out. An increase in overall harvest when you combine the human and marine mammal harvest. And all of the above actually leading to smaller adult sizes. I think that's one of the ways we're seeing density dependence. It's a function also of changing food webs. It's also a function of the size selectivity of the orca harvest. Remember that doubling of Alaska down to BC orca populations. Orcas really don't start to cue in on fish till they're fairly large. So we've got multiple things driving smaller, physically smaller sized adult returns. All right, so that was the Pacific. We now want to talk about the Columbia. And when you look at a really high level at the Columbia, this is the count at Bonneville since '38. We're lucky to have pretty good counts since then. And you can see a few things. You can see we're not necessarily at this level losing fish in the Columbia. In fact, the last 20 years have looked far better than any other time in the last 90 years. You can see that we have the return of coho above Bonneville over time. Not sure. And then also the expanding population of sockeye. And we've seen some really strong Chinook runs. So if you just looked at this gross level, you'd be saying, hey, things look pretty good. And the one that always surprises people is when you do the same thing for the snake. And you say, hey, you know, we hear constantly of the snake on the edge of extinction. Certainly true, and true for a long time for Snake River sockeye. In addition to the passage issues in the dams, we wrote and owned them. We did about everything we could to get rid of them, and we're struggling to get them back. But for Chinook and Steelhead at this higher level, yeah, we've seen some good years. And while our recent years haven't been great, they certainly haven't been as bad as we saw back in the 90s. So again, at a high level, you can feel optimistic about the Columbia. When you start to break it down, you really see that in the Columbia, that's been on the back of the summer and fall Chinook runs. The blue is the fall Chinook run. That both wild Hanford Reach fish and other areas and hatchery produced fish. It's a lot of integrated production. We've done a lot to change how we manage the main stem Columbia, the flow releases, et cetera. Many of you know that far better than I. But I would say that fall and summer Chinook in the Columbia are a success story. Remember, we're seeing these kinds of numbers in our bad years recently, actually above even most of our better years prior to the 1990s. And this is after Fisheries. They're supporting fairly heavy exploitation rates for what we, at least for what we consider heavy these days, 30, 50% on many of these stocks. And after that marine mammal consumption. So the fall and summer Chinook, we're seeing really at the basis of the whole Columbia Snake Basin looking pretty good. The red, yeah, we go from fairly consistent with some variability to some great years for spring Chinook to really some pretty poor years lately. So this is, again, at the Columbia Basin level. If you had to say pick a winner, it'd be the fall Chinook. If you had to pick a run that really looked more challenged, it'd be the spring Chinook. Bonneville Steelhead run, yeah, doesn't feel quite as strong. The wild fish in orange below, our Steelhead and the Yakima are wild runs, so we'll be focused on this component. But even hatchery fish in this Columbia, despite still pretty substantial hatchery production, have been really down in the last few years. So if you have to look at the Columbia as a whole, you'd say, yeah, there's been an encouraging increase in upper Columbia sockeye, not in the snake. We're seeing the reestablishment of coho. That's a story whose conclusion's yet to be written, but I think a really exciting one to follow. I want to highlight that impressive performance of the fall summer Chinook complex in the snake and Columbia. We really are seeing a lot of integrated wild and hatchery production. We've got good and bad years, but a positive long-term trend. And again, they are supporting really substantial fisheries and contributing to marine mammal recovery. Contrast that to what really comes home to bear in the Yakima. Columbia-wide, we're seeing significant recent declines in Steelhead and spring Chinook runs. So we talked about getting them back to Bonneville. What happens getting from Bonneville back to the Yakima? These are just out of the DART system. They are conversion rate diagrams. They're pit-tagged fish that were tagged originally in the Yakima Basin, detected as returning adults at Bonneville, and the ratio you're seeing here is how many of those fish at Bonneville were subsequently, that came from the Yakima's juveniles, subsequently passed Prosser. Versus Steelhead, you can see on average, 65% of the pit-tagged Steelhead that passed Bonneville that came from the Yakima make it past Prosser. This is actually pretty surprising. When we wrote the recovery plans with NOAA, we were assuming 90% survival up the Columbia. We've had a lot of discussions about overshoot, and that's a huge issue for the John Day. But for Yakima fish, only about 10% are overshooting. And of those, we actually get pretty high survival rates. They drop back down later in the year and make it to Prosser. So we are seeing losses whether this is due to warm water years, whether it's due to catch and release mortalities. Again, we've got recreational fisheries that are meant to be catch and release for wild steelhead, but we know have some impact, whether it's other factors driving it, whether it's bycatch and other fisheries. We're seeing surprisingly low adult returns for steelhead. And interestingly, for non-listed spring Chinook, here's the same graph. Now remember, these fish are the target of fisheries. This is after Bonneville, but both the pretty significant recreational fisheries and tribal fisheries, that these are part of the complex, we're seeing actually a pooled rate of 75%. And interesting, where Chinook, the rates have dropped a little in recent years. Steelhead, we saw the last few years a little up near 80%. So we, especially for steelhead, we seem to have some challenges getting our adults up the Columbia that we still have to get our heads around. And for the Yakima, overshoot doesn't seem to be the driver the way it is for a lot of other stocks. So this is one of the puzzles I think we need to be looking hard at. All right, so if we can get fish back to Prosser. Here, I just see two chats. Let me check there. If we can get fish back to Prosser, what's happening? Well, here's the overall run at Prosser since we had good data in the 1980s. And you can see overall, it looks like a success story. We had some really, 83 is probably some poor counts as well, but Eastie can tell us. But looking at the 90s, small Chinook runs, 500 to 1,000 fish some years, small steelhead runs, don't even start to see coho from the reintroduction program till the 90s. And the purple here is sockeye starting to come back in. And it's really going to be fascinating to watch that play out over time as we get passage and as we get fish adapting to the unique conditions of the Yakima. So some really, you can see we had some years where if you had asked us in 2015, 16 how we were doing, oh, we were feeling pretty good about the increases. Seen a real drop since then. It's been easy to say that's just the ocean. I don't know if that helps us or not. Part of the point I want to make is when you look across the overall range and even within the Columbia, even if you compare lower Columbia steelhead stocks to above Bonneville, you see all show some trend from the ocean, but from the analyses I've seen, that's about 50% of the variability. There's other stuff going on too. So let's dive a little more into the Yakima. Oops. First, the steelhead run. This to me is the depressing graph. The nice thing you can see, since some changes in barging, the small hatchery component we might, stray component we might have is gone. The Yakima fish are really Yakima genetics, which is pretty neat. We're one of a few places that can really claim that. You can see that our 10-year geomean really climbed, and while it wasn't distributed in across the populations quite as what we needed, the aggregate numbers were getting into the range we'd need to even talk about delisting if we could deal with our spatial structure criteria. But we've really seen that drop off. And this year to date, I just ran this today, we are only at 500 odd steelhead for this brood year when we should have half, if not 2/3 of the run through. So this is looking to be the worst steelhead year for the Yakima since 1996. Pretty sobering and pretty at odds, say, with that overall fall Chinook in the Columbia story, where I said, hey, look at this Bonneville graph and you feel like an optimist. Nothing simple in our salmon world. Here's the Yakima Spring Chinook run reconstruction that Bill Bosch does over time, just showing the changes in abundance in the upper Yakima and Natchez populations. And remember, it's, oops, I'm sorry. We had a big boost right before the hatchery went online, and since then we've seen a pretty good numbers with some variability in the upper Yakima population. And the Natchez has held on, not as large, but consistently. You'll see all the spring Chinook have been way down now for 3-4 years. And the Natchez spring Chinook, especially, that run reconstruction, 2019, I think we were looking at 32 reds in the whole Natchez, American, Little Natchez, Rattlesnake areas. A little bit better in 2020. I didn't have the 2021 data here, but I think you can see improvements in good years, but still real constraints for the upper Yakima spring Chinook, and I think pretty dire straits for the Natchez spring Chinook, which is our wild control for the hatchery program. That question of what's going on with Natchez spring Chinook, it's probably more than the ocean. We did have the fires up there. We've had some hot years. I wonder a lot about adult holding habitats, and I don't know if we've got data on pre-spawn mortality. Some of you on the call may be able to jump in with that. But just like I said for steelhead, this year is really dire. I'd say Natchez spring Chinook, that wild only population there, is one we have to be looking really hard at. Put it in perspective, this is out of the just released science report that goes into NOAA's 5-year review that should be out this middle of this year. You can see, I know it's small text, the 4 Yakima Basin populations, Sadis Creek, Toppenish, Natchez River, and Upper Yakima. The axes are pretty different. You can see the Natchez, we got up as high as almost 2,000, maybe even as much as 3,000 fish, and have come way down, but still doing quite a bit better than our lows in the 1990s. Toppenish has come back right to where it was in the 90s after some great years. Sadis Creek has been our stronghold. It definitely comes up in the bad years. It's a little above where it was, but still, not what we want to see. And the Upper Yakima main stem, note that it's only up to 600 here. Yeah, we've gotten up as many as 500 fish, way better than 50. And we've seen it drop back down to 200, less than that last year, which didn't make the cutoff for the date year. You'll notice when you look at all the other populations in Washington and Oregon of mid-sea steelhead, many places show similar or even worse trends. And I think I cut off the Tucci by accident, but yeah, the Tucci, the Deschutes River, things are not looking good for mid-sea steelhead in specific. Again, some of the lower Columbia runs, these graphs are quite a bit more promising. There are exceptions. The Middle Fork John Day actually seems to have turned a corner. South Fork John Day, you can spend a lot more time with these. The point is there's a drop across the range, and there's specific places, really Toppenish and the Upper Yakima especially, where that drop is putting fish back to lows that we hope not to see again. So I just went through a lot of things pretty quickly. What I wanted to highlight was just that both globally and locally, salmon recovery is a real mix of successes and declines. Sometimes we feel really good about things. Sometimes we get pessimistic. That's all over. Well, it depends on the variability between runs, between years, between locations is incredible. We see some real success stories we can be proud of, but I would say this is a pretty critical time for steelhead and spring Chinook in the Yakima, and really the mid-Columbia in general. And I highlighted here, and I'd really love to open this up to discussion. There's a whole nother presentation here, but I don't know that I'm the one to give it on where we should be putting our effort to address the pretty marked downturns we've seen, both Columbia-wide and even more intensely within the Yakima. I think within the basin, yeah, we've really come to understand that in bad years, in addition to ocean issues, we've got some big smolt survival issues in the Yakima, down through the McNary Pool, probably to a lesser degree through the rest of the Columbia. But definitely a big smolt survival hole where we can produce juveniles out of core habitat that does well, even in those poorer years with less adult returns in terms of producing smolts. But we get see really high rates of loss. We've really in the basin, many of you in this know, we are really pivoting to address these smolt losses. I'd also note that I think this really forces us to think about what we can do to protect and enhance our core habitats. So a lot of our work has been focused on expanding the range, especially of steelhead, and moving them into tribs that have been blocked, moving them higher up into smaller headwork trib networks. When we have a lot of fish, we see fish spread out really widely. Where we have good red counts, you see this. And in these lesser years, you see this distribution really contract to the core habitats, the areas that probably have been the most intact over time. those are the areas that we are counting on for the production to get us back up to where we can make use of a lot of the expanding habitats we've been focusing a lot of our habitat effort in. I've been thinking a lot about the upper Natchez from the Y on up through to the headwaters of the Natchez, and also the upper Yakima. These are the real primo core areas for both spring Chinook and steelhead production when you look at red counts and radio tracking. They're areas that have been fairly good condition in larger rivers where we've done less work than in a lot of the smaller tribs. But I really hope we're able to look hard at those and assess what's working and also what's not. What can we do? Thinking of the Natchez in the hot years we've had, there's some skinny water up there. What are we doing to really manage for resilient cold water, adult Chinook holding water? What are we doing to really do the projects that expand mainstem steelhead production in those reaches? I'm thinking more and more about those core habitats. It doesn't mean to discount the work in what I would call the higher up headwater habitats and trib habitats, but in these poor years, we're really seeing a lot of contraction. And some of those tribs, you know, Teanaway or Little Natchez, I would throw in that core. But yeah, I think with those conversion rates, we've got to really understand what's going on with adult steelhead survival in the mainstem Columbia. You know, just seeing another 20% of our adults survive would be a big bump, especially in these poor years we've been seeing. I think, and this goes way beyond just our runs, thinking what we can do to reduce nearshore pinniped predation. So we've got the control and hazing programs at Bonneville. There's talk and maybe some action starting on how do we reduce haul out areas and other areas. Bonneville's the point. You can go down there. I've taken my family when my kids were young and it was first a big deal. I remember having a picnic there on Bradford Island and sort of taking bets between the sea lions and the folks in the boats as to who was going to drive who away, and the sea lions always won. You can see it there, but you look at some of the papers that have come out. Yeah, that is 10, 15% at Bonneville, 50% total estimated take in the lower Columbia from the ocean to Bonneville in some years. So what can we do to reduce haul outs? How do we think about managing these marine mammal populations? Do we just root for the disease events that cause density independent declines in them? Do we make a great white shark hatchery? I'm kidding there, but great white sharks and transient orcas are actually, when the transients come into South Puget Sound, the Nisqually smolt survival numbers go up within the week. And they figure it's because the seals are just that much warier and less their foraging efficiency drops when they're worried about it. And the last thing I wanted to throw out is emerging. Hard enough to get a salmon treaty focused on adult harvest, but I do think the science is pointing us to really having to think about ocean density dependence. And mostly people roll their eyes and say, we can't do anything about the ocean, but we can. You know, when you think about the trade-offs, that it's not hatchery versus wild, it's one run of fish versus another. How do we allocate that ocean capacity across runs? I think that's a place we'll have to go. It's not a place we're going to go just in the Yakima, but I think the Pacific Salmon Treaty for Adults is a great model of the kind of broad discussions that we should be having about how we allocate juvenile capacity in the ocean. Someday, do we even get to where you're having international discussions with Asia about that? I don't know. I think that one we have to see where the science leads us. But I'm going to end there and stop sharing so we can open up some discussion. Really, this talk was as much about the beyond as the Yakima. Many of you know the details much more than I, but I hope that synthesis was useful and gave some things to rattle around in your brains. I hope I gave you some good ideas to run with, and I hope you'll set me straight on some of my bad ideas.
Well, thanks, Alex. We're going to open the floor for questions. If anybody has anybody, if you want to type it in the chat, I'll read them to Alex. But feel free to ask away.
Hey, Alex, I really miss talking to you about this in the office all the time. I mean, from everything you're showing, that was an awesome presentation. I mean, to me, it's kind of showing, most of the data is showing that, you know, conditions in our streams must be pretty poor because it's favoring all those salmon species that spend the least amount of time in fresh water, right? They pretty much lay their eggs, hatch, and move straight out to the ocean. So I would just kind of, wonder what your thoughts are on that. And then as a follow-up question, I didn't know what your thoughts were on, like, if we were able to tear out some of those Snake River dams, how that might impact the fishery for the Yakima.
For the Yakima, on the first one, I don't think it's as easy as just shorter stream residence equals doing better. I think there's also, when you look at the overall Pacific, a lot more biogeographical stuff going on. You have a lot of areas where freshwater is either cold or limited enough to not be nearly as productive, where those species do really well. You've got entire parts of the range where there are no Chinook and Steelhead on the Asian side. So I think historically they've been dominant. It's not just a function of loss of freshwater productivity. And but yeah, I don't think it's also the fact that I think what makes it so hard is that the spring Chinook and the Steelhead, the longest freshwater residents, get the double whammy of variable freshwater conditions and changes in the ocean. And I also think that as we've seen the pinniped growth, you see a lot less focus in the ocean. There's certainly a fair number of chum eaten by the orcas, but in general, especially on the juvenile end with the seal predation, they're just not as much a focus as the larger smolts coming out of freshwater. So some of it may well be freshwater habitat conditions, but I think you see other dynamics that come into play. Snake River dams and the Yakima, I mean, the answer for the Yakima to me is pretty easy. It's not going to change diddly for the Yakima. Our fish turn left, the Snake River fish turn right. I don't see a strong relationship there.
What about having less super warm Snake River water during the summer when our springers and our steelhead are trying to migrate up the Columbia? That would help cool down the Columbia below the Yakima in theory, and then also that would help flush out our juveniles faster too if there was less water being held back and controlled by those dams. That's just kind of my.
I mean, those dams are largely run of the river, so I don't think on the smolt size they'd make a big difference unless you really change like Dvorak operations. Again, others on this call know more than I. On the, I think for our spring Chinook and Steelhead, they're generally moving when Columbia conditions are less limiting. They're not, if I had to focus on anywhere to test that hypothesis, it'd be the summer Chinook and sockeye runs. How much colder the snake would or wouldn't be, the snake pre-dams and also pre-Dvorak was surprisingly warm a lot of years in summer. There's limited data. We didn't have thermistors then. We just had mercury thermometers someone would stick in, but it's not universally cold water. I'd love to see some really good models. I'm sure they've been done. I haven't dove into it because I work in Yakima. Really looking at expected temperature regimes and how you could manage that. You do have that big chunk of cold water that we got in exchange for giving up that chunk of the clear water that's called Dvorak, and that probably makes, even in recent years, we've seen that really be the key to getting fish through a warming Snake River. So I'd love to play with your hypotheses, but my initial sense is I don't imagine that unless there are big management changes besides just removing the run of the river, that it would really affect ours. Maybe the biggest change would be the degree that a lot of walleye seem to be, and bass now, moving up into the Snake. Would you change conditions enough to change the predatory species dynamics coming down into the McNary pool? But I'm just hypothesizing here. Let's see, I see Michael has a chat in the, or said he had a question in the chat box.
Yeah, Alex, thanks so much. I mean, first, I just want to say thank you for such a refreshing and objective and optimistic presentation. I mean, it's just really refreshing to hear someone break out of some of the normal kind of rhetorical paradigms about fish in the world and in the Northwest and in the Columbia. Much appreciated. Also, as far as your fish and beyond, your Columbia Basin and beyond, I would note that right now there is the 2022 International Year of the Salmon. It's a pan-Pacific research effort going on with research specialists from NOAA, from Canada, and from Russia. And so who would ever thought hearing about the tensions at the Ukrainian border potentially affecting international salmon crews happening in the Pacific right now. But I guess right now that Russian vessel is steaming towards the Aleutian, and we hope that it will continue that on that research effort. I appreciated your comments about the kind of mystery about some of the disappearing adults, in the migration corridor. And similarly, we know that just like in the Yakima and the Snake, there's places where there's kind of juvenile losses that we just don't understand. And I was curious if you had any thoughts about how the collective kind of research and monitoring paradigm might be made more nimble to try to address some of those emerging concerns that, we just really don't know what to do to address those questions as they come up. And it seems like it's really slow to turn kind of existing research and monitoring programs to kind of redirect them to those things that are emerging. I thought you said something about in the Yakima potentially pivoting on the juvenile issue, and just was curious to learn more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think how you get robust and broad-based collaborative science to pick at some of these questions is one of the key things. And I think we got some good success stories. I love the ocean research you just mentioned. I've been following that a little and probably should have mentioned it, but that's been really already generating a lot of interesting findings from that more coordinated international ocean survey work. For Puget Sound, where I'd say conditions are in many ways more dire even than here, the Sailor Sea Survival Study was an incredible effort that brought together scientists from BC, from the US, from tribes, from states, from feds, from nonprofits, and created a collaborative. That really has been unlocking a lot of the questions on juvenile survival in saltwater for Puget Sound, and has really, some of the research that I was referencing is stuff that may have originally come out of that work. For instance, the pink Chinook interactions in the Sound. The Hood Canal Bridge is an example of a place where good targeted science really pinpointed a limiting factor. We're losing 50% of smolts, steelhead smolts coming out of Hood Canal because they are getting preyed upon because of the way that bridge is structured. Well, that points you to a $100 million bridge project that otherwise never would make it on the table. In the Yakima, the survival studies that Yakima Nation, USGS Joint Board, NOAA, everyone has been collaborating on and piecing together funding for. Without those, I don't think we'd be doing the projects at Sunnyside Dam or queuing up stuff at Chandler, or really returning to a lot of intense focus on in-stream flow and screening issues in the big main stem reaches of the Yakima if we didn't have that science. How do you fund those kinds of big collaborative science things that really are focused on the weak points in the life cycle? And then how do you turn those into action? I've been daydreaming about how would you create a new competitive science program that basically requires you to show that logic model and why you pick this weak point in a life cycle model, a bottleneck, and how that relates to action. Because yeah, we have a lot of fairly static science programs. We've got some really good work that we need to continue that cues up some parts of the answers. But where we see these intensive studies that are really focused on limiting factors, or at least hypothesized limit, that's when I think we find out the new things that we're not going to solve just by doing the same sets of projects we've been doing for 10 years.
I appreciate that. Let's talk and see if there's any way we can kind of leverage this current administration focus on a long-term solution in the Columbia to wire in some of those needs.
Are there any other questions for Alex?
Yeah, Alex, this
Sounds
is
like you
Steve.
covered all the bases, Alex.
Yeah, jump in, Steve.
Yeah, Mike, can I jump in here? Alex, this is a great job. I really appreciate drawing all of these various sources of information together and trying to synthesize it for us. all. And but what I'm left with, and this is I don't. This is not a criticism, Alex, but I'm left with not having any better sense of the numbers after all of this is said and done, because it is just all so confusing still, as you've pointed out. And so I wonder if there is some way, and of course I haven't been real close to the science side of the salmon management coastwide for some time. And so there may be work headed in this direction that I'm just not aware of, but there seems to be a fair amount of variability in the abundance graphs that you were showing. And it seems to me that, or at least my experience has been back when I used to be a scientist, that when you have a lot of variability in the data, it usually gives you the opportunity to look for associations in other data sets that that may correlate, and from that you can start to pick out hypotheses, specific questions to start looking at, to try to answer where the heck is the mortality occurring, or and is it something that we think we can manage for or correct. And for example, one thing that comes to my mind, and I was kind of shocked by this some years ago when it was pointed out that this was had to do with spring Chinook in the Wenatchee system, and we were, all of the co-managers were working very hard to get spring Chinook escapements into the Wenatchee and all of the tributaries, and found out somebody had done some work. One of the state guys was doing work on the spawning grounds and reported that there's up to 65% pre-spawn mortality of the spring Chinook that we put on the spawning grounds. And I thought, holy mackerel, what is it? We ought to be able to sort of figure out what is going on there, because that's a shocking number. That's a really sad number. If through all of our efforts we have managed to get fish on the spawning grounds, and we're losing 2/3 of them for reasons that at that time anyway were unknown. So that sort of thing. I don't mean to go on and on about this, but you can maybe get the sense of how confused I am by my rambling here about trying to make sense of the numbers. So without actually having said anything really very enlightening or profound, I just again want to thank you for putting all of this out here. It's a lot of food for thought. I'm just trying to figure out how to make use of it, I guess, in the best way. So
Yeah,
thanks.
and, like many things, when I was first thinking about this presentation, I wanted to push it there more and talk to more people and try and pull that in. And by the time I finally got going, always slightly later, and then they moved me up in time, I realized just what I gave you was the time block. But that brainstorming about, okay, now that we've sort of been able to focus on, from my perspective, the critical state of mid-sea steelhead and Chinook, and for specifically within the Yakima, how would you start to tear apart that life cycle diagram and weight the different things I've talked about and the things that we haven't even discussed? The pre-spawn mortality you see on the Wenatchee, I was just talking to someone about that. I don't think we know the pre-spawn mortality rates on, say, the Natchez River. If we do have data, I haven't seen it. 2019, hot years, fires, holes filling in. I wouldn't be surprised if that was a bottleneck. But you've also got 50% mortality, if you take some of the estimates for just sea lion mortality from saltwater up to Bonneville. I think the life cycle models are really valuable, and they've really come a long way. And keeping them simple enough that they don't become black boxes, but just life cycle models where we can throw out some hypotheses, test them, and say, okay, these are the 3 hypotheses that really drove the model in a different direction. Then, like Michael was saying, how do we pivot scientific resources to do rapid response science that, science is never quick, but it's amazing that with the right resources and collaboration, especially with all the data you can mine with modern data mining techniques, 5 years investment, being willing to make that investment 5 years out to break out hypotheses to find those bottlenecks in the life cycle is critical. And I'm in a lot of meetings where we have a sense, but often our sense is really generic. Oh, we're doing fine. It's just a bad ocean year, or, oh gosh, we're never going to get anywhere because the ocean's going to hell in a handbasket, or you hear people really simplify and extrapolate very rapidly, and sometimes even in contradictory directions. The more we can really put that life cycle model on the wall and play with specific hypotheses, and then throw resources at it and commit 5 years ahead of time. It's the old adage about planting a tree is just as true about doing the science. It's what's the best time to plant a tree? 30 years ago. What's the next best time? Today. Investing in science is the exact same way. And I must admit, there are a lot of times I'm in meetings where people say, oh, we couldn't get good answers. We can't do, well, yeah, we can't do academic level science and promise you a 95% confidence interval. Can we do enough science to point us to which bottlenecks we really need to be throwing resources at? I think the survival studies done in the last 5-10 years in the Yakima are a perfect example of that. The Hood Canal Bridge study, we're changing the direction of $100 million investments because someone actually decided to spend a few $100,000 and build a really strong team across multiple organizations to answer a specific question. And sometimes the answer will be, oops, that wasn't the problem. That shot missed, but that's valuable. I don't know if that helps at all. I'm just as confused as you, but I'm looking for, okay, how do we structure adaptive science? How do we talk about, how do we get the people on the ground engaged with the science community, looking at life cycle models, identifying bottlenecks, coordinating science? Because I think we often have a real division between a more academic mindset around the science and a very practical, hands-on, but sometimes not thinking as much about the complexities and bottlenecks on the management side.
Yeah, I guess, Alex, I would maybe finish up by saying I would be more concerned that if we were not concerned and
Yep.
looking at the trends, we're not confused about the trends we're seeing. That would suggest to me that we really don't know what we're looking at.
Yeah, any last questions? It's good to see all of you here, and yeah, hope that was worthwhile. Anyone got a solution? Oh.
Thanks, Alex. It's always good to hear your wisdom.
I'm not sure I call it that, my reckless hypothesizing.
And you have to think about it in order to do that, and we like that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex, for coming on. That was awesome.
Ralph was giving his plug for the lamprey. Just want to make sure that was seen. Yeah, well, I want to thank everybody for coming. If there's any more questions to throw in there, feel free to jump them in. But I want to make sure everybody knows and remembers that next month we're going to have Kat Stothman presenting on the cottonwood establishment in the Yakima Basin, what we're learning for fish. That's March 8th at 7 p.m. With that plug behind me, Alex, thank you so very much. It's always great to listen to you speak and share your vast knowledge. We really appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming, too.
Thanks, Alex. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see all of you. And yeah, Connor, come visit sometime, or maybe we'll knock on your door.
I'd love to, and yes, please come stay.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Hey, Connor.
Yeah, Alex, good job.